Levi jeans. America's most experienced combat operators decided the pants the Army issued weren't worth wearing. Not the rookies, not the garrison soldiers, Navy SEALs, Green Berets, MACV's SOG, the most classified special operations unit of the Vietnam War. They stripped off their issued jungle fatigues and replaced them with Levi's. $5. Zero military testing, zero Army approval. The Army called the jungle fatigue adequate. Operators called it a liability. This is what that looked like. Rung Sat Special Zone, 1971. Before dawn, a SEAL Team 1 patrol moves through the mangrove channels in Levi's 501s, with women's pantyhose under the denim. Nothing they are wearing was issued by the United States Army. The Army had no answer for leeches. A lingerie counter did. Natick Laboratories, the Army's own clothing lab, existed to prevent exactly that. The problem was what it produced instead, and what the Army did with the answers. Every time, for 60 years. A jungle trouser that disintegrated in the terrain it was designed for. Levi's stocked at U.S. military bases because operators refused the issued alternative. A two-man civilian firm that built a better combat trouser than Natick and watched the Army ignore it for a decade. And soldiers burning in nylon uniforms in Iraq, while U.S. pilots had worn flame-resistant fabric for 30 years. This is that story. 1941. The M1941 herringbone twill fatigue trouser, 100% cotton, designed as a work uniform. The Pacific Theater used it as a combat trouser anyway. The answer to why those SEALs reached for Levi's starts here. Triple canopy jungle shredded it at the knee within days. Wet cotton absorbed moisture and held it, adding weight for hours after every river crossing. Skin breakdown and jungle rot appeared in after-action reports before the end of 1942. The Army documented every case. The M1943 field trouser followed. Cotton sateen, new cargo pockets, the same fundamental problem in a refined package. The Quartermaster Corps filed the reports and moved on. Then came Korea, 1950, the opposite problem. Temperatures dropping to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The M1951 field trouser was 18-ounce wool serge, a genuine improvement. It was still not enough. Thousands of Americans were hospitalized for frostbite in the first winter of the Korean War alone. Not combat wounds, the cold. This time, the Army built an institution to solve it. 1954. Natick Laboratories, Natick, Massachusetts. One mandate: develop soldier clothing for every terrain, every climate, every conflict. The Army finally had an institution whose entire reason for existing was to make sure the Pacific and Korea could never happen again. In the early 1960s, that institution turned its attention to Southeast Asia. On paper, the Army was ahead of the problem for the first time. 1965, Natick had an answer. Special Forces advisors had been operating in South Vietnam since 1961. By the time the first major U.S. combat formations landed in force in 1965, Natick had already been developing jungle-specific clothing for several years. The product was the Tropical Combat Uniform, the TCU. Lightweight cotton poplin construction, better ventilation than the standard cotton field uniform. A cut designed for tropical humidity, using OG 107 cotton sateen fabric to minimize water retention. A genuine advancement over anything the Pacific veterans wore. On paper, the answer Natick was built to produce. Before it failed, understand what it was failing in. The Rung Sat Special Zone sits south of Saigon, a dense maze of mangrove channels, tidal rivers, and flooded jungle that the Viet Cong used as a resupply corridor. Navy SEAL Team 1 ran direct action missions in this environment. River crossings in darkness, ambushes at the water's edge, extractions under fire with wet gear and no margin for noise. Every piece of clothing had an operational consequence. Weight affected endurance. Sound affected survival. Fabric that failed in water could end a mission before it started. This is the environment Natick designed the TCU for. Picture the patrol loadout: rifle, ammunition, radio, grenades, water for 36 hours, medical kit. Everything you carry, you feel. When you step into a river channel, chest deep, rifle over your head, 6 meters of black water between you and the far bank, the TCU absorbs that water and holds it. For the next 2 hours of movement through the undergrowth, you are carrying the weight of saturated cotton against your legs on top of everything else. Cotton dries slowly when the air itself is saturated. The TCU trouser that left the staging area at 2200 hours and entered the first channel at 0100 would still be damp at dawn. On the movement out through rattan and thorned secondary growth, damp cotton moves. Not loud, not dramatic, a whisper of fabric against a bamboo stem, a drag against an equipment strap. In a quiet jungle, at a moment when sound discipline determines whether you complete the extraction or become the target of one, it is enough to matter. The trousers were also coming apart. The cotton poplin could not sustain continuous contact with the rattan and thorned understory of the Mekong Delta. By the 4th or 5th extended patrol, trouser legs that had left the base intact came back shredded at the knee. This was not misuse. This was the environment the TCU had been designed for, doing what that environment does. Natick received the after-action reports. The TCU went through multiple iterations, pattern modifications, construction adjustments. In 1969, Natick tested a nylon-cotton blend with better mosquito bite protection and shipped a limited run of sets to Vietnam for field trials. The blend was never adopted. The fabric choice did not change. At some point in 1969 or 1970, an operator in the Rung Sat reached for a different answer. The most documented early adopter was Kirby Horrell, Foxtrot Platoon, SEAL Team 1, on his 1970 Vietnam tour. Horrell later described the shift plainly. "We started getting Levi's and started wearing Levi jeans with our cami tops. They lasted a lot longer than any other type of clothing." In the Mekong Delta, in the Rung Sat Special Zone, in the river systems of the Ca Mau Peninsula, Navy SEAL teams reached a different conclusion. Jeans, Levi's 501 and 505 models. Retail price, approximately $4 to $6 per pair in the mid-1960s, about $5, the equivalent of roughly $50 today. Within months of initial platoon rotations adopting them, the practice had spread widely enough that Levi's jeans were being stocked at U.S. military base exchange stores in Vietnam specifically to meet operator demand. The reasons were operational and had nothing to do with fashion. The first time you wear them on a patrol, the difference registers before you can explain it. You cross the first channel and come up the far bank. The denim weighs more going in than the TCU did, but it sheds. Within the first hour of movement, the weight differential is gone. Within 2 hours, the denim has released enough moisture that the sound signature through the undergrowth has dropped below what the TCU produced soaked. By the end of the first patrol, the jeans are intact. The knee is not shredded. The fabric that spent 2 hours against rattan and thorned undergrowth looks like it spent 2 hours against rattan and thorned undergrowth, not like it lost the argument. By the time you have worn them on 3 patrols, the color is no longer blue. 30 minutes in the swamp water and organic material of the delta channels, and the denim has absorbed enough that the color signature has disappeared into the terrain around it. No treatment, no design decision at Natick, just fabric doing something the TCU had not been built to do. 1 pair, 9 months. The $5 civilian pant outlasted the purpose-built military solution designed for exactly that terrain. Think about that. Natick Laboratories, operating with the full institutional resources of the United States Army, designed a combat trouser for jungle warfare that failed to outperform a civilian work pant developed for California gold miners in 1873. Not engineered for combat, not optimized for military use, not tested for tropical operations. A $5 retail product, and it worked better. Here is what makes this more than an anecdote. The Army knew. Levi's jeans were being stocked at U.S. military base exchange stores in Vietnam, stores operated and supplied by the United States Army, specifically because the demand from operators had become impossible to ignore. The Army was supplying its own people with the civilian product that outperformed its own issued uniform. Natick kept issuing the TCU. The operators kept buying the jeans. The institutional record contained both facts simultaneously. The distance between what the system produced and what the people wearing it needed, that distance had not closed. The SEAL teams were not the only operators going outside the catalog. McVee's SOG units were running missions in locally acquired tiger stripe camouflage. Vietnamese pattern gear sourced from local markets, never issued by any U.S. procurement system that was better suited to Southeast Asian vegetation than anything the Army had issued them. Operators had gone so far outside the system, they were wearing the visual signature of the war zone itself. But the jeans were not the only solution in the civilian catalog. Pantyhose, women's nylon hosiery, worn under the jeans against the skin. Leeches could penetrate military socks and work their way through trouser cuffs. Nylon hosiery is too smooth for leeches to grip effectively. Operators in theater were ordering it through the U.S. military mail system in bulk. Not one line in Army field doctrine addressed this, because the Army had not developed it. Condoms over the muzzle of an M16 during river crossings, the only waterproof solution anyone had found for keeping water out of the barrel. Not one line in the weapons manual, because the Army had not invented it. 3 civilian products, all 3 more operationally effective than the issued equivalent, all 3 self-sourced by the people doing the job. The Army received the documentation. The field feedback went to Natick. The evidence was in the file. The next standard U.S. Army combat trouser was introduced in 1981. It was not made of denim. It was better than the TCU in almost every way, and it contained a flaw that would take 20 years and a war in Iraq to fully expose. 1981 BDU. The battle dress uniform was a genuine improvement over the TCU. The M81 Woodland pattern, 4-color camouflage in green, brown, black, and tan, replaced the older Erdl design that had come out of Vietnam. The fabric was a 50-50 cotton-nylon blend, more durable than straight cotton. The construction was more practical. The pocket placement was better. On paper, the BDU was the most capable combat uniform the Army had ever produced. And to be fair, the Army was not designing clothing for one patrol in one swamp. It was designing a single uniform for hundreds of thousands of soldiers across multiple climates, multiple theaters, multiple decades of potential conflict. A cotton-nylon blend that performed acceptably across all those conditions had genuine institutional logic. You cannot run a global military on denim. What the Army did not prioritize was one material property it had understood since the Pacific: nylon melts. Apply sufficient heat to a cotton-nylon blend and the nylon component liquefies. It does not burn away. It adheres to whatever surface it contacts. The Air Force had known this since the 1970s and had acted on it. Army helicopter crews wore Nomex. Tank crews wore fire-resistant coveralls. The Army kept nylon in the ground infantry uniform because on the Cold War battlefield it was designing for, the primary threat was ballistic, not thermal. The BDU was the most capable combat uniform the Army had ever produced. It was also the uniform that would melt onto its wearers in Iraq. That logic held for the war the Army expected. For Desert Storm in 1991, the Army fielded the 6-color Desert BDU, the pattern soldiers called chocolate chip. Green, brown, tan, black with white highlights. Effective in some desert terrain, less so in others. By the late 90s, the 3-color DCU, Desert Camouflage Uniform, in tan, brown, and dark brown had replaced it. 2 different desert uniforms in a decade, both reactive, both designed after the previous war had already shown what was needed. The pattern from Vietnam had not stopped. The catalog had just changed. The Gulf War ended. The BDU and DCU remained in service. The Army began developing its next-generation uniform. The Army Combat Uniform was announced in 2004. The ACU used the same 50-50 nylon-cotton blend that had been in the BDU, the same material that melted, now fielded on every infantry soldier in an IED war. It was fielded in 2005, at the height of the Iraq insurgency, in a country where the dominant method of killing and wounding U.S. ground troops was an improvised explosive device, a weapon that produced, as its secondary effect, intense localized heat. 2005, Fallujah, IED. The Army Combat Uniform arrived in Iraq with 4 official improvements: updated camouflage in the universal camouflage pattern, redesigned pockets for better functionality, improved fit under body armor, and enhanced material durability. By the Army's own account, a significant upgrade over the BDU. In the field, it arrived in a war defined by a threat it was not designed to survive. By 2005, the improvised explosive device was the leading cause of death and serious injury for U.S. ground forces in Iraq. An IED detonation produces blast overpressure, fragmentation, and a thermal event. A soldier who survives the blast and fragmentation envelope is still inside the fire. The ACU is in that fire with him. Nylon does not burn, it melts. The distinction matters clinically. When the nylon component of the ACU reaches its melting point, it liquefies and adheres to the nearest surface. The nearest surface is the skin underneath. Military burn surgeons treating IED casualties from Iraq were documenting nylon adhesion wounds, uniform material fused to tissue, requiring surgical removal, as a distinct injury pattern from the blast itself. The uniform was still attached to the wound when the soldiers arrived at the aid station. The Army knew nylon melts. The Air Force had known since the late 1960s and had acted on it. Army aviation crews had worn Nomex for decades. The Army fielded the ACU to ground infantry in the same nylon-cotton blend it had used for decades, a material the Air Force had replaced for its own crews 30 years earlier. The fix did not come from inside the system. By 2006, military medical officers were describing what was happening publicly. Navy Captain Lynn Welling, surgeon for the 1st Marine Logistics Group in Iraq, stated that synthetic materials worn by troops would melt and fuse to the skin in blast and fire events. The concern extended beyond commercial undergarments to standard issue fabric. Congressional pressure mounted on the Army to explain why its ground troops were fighting in a material that the Air Force had replaced for air crews decades earlier. The answer the Army gave, that the primary threat to infantry was ballistic, not thermal, was no longer holding up against the evidence coming back from Fallujah and Ramadi. In 2007, the Army introduced the Flame-Resistant Army Combat Uniform, the FRACU. Defender M fabric, 65% flame-resistant rayon, 25% para-aramid, 10% nylon. The Army's stated purpose was explicit: to reduce burn injuries caused by improvised explosive devices, not to improve camouflage, not to improve functionality, to stop the uniform from melting onto soldiers. The FRACU was fielded beginning in 2007. Army medical facilities reported a measurable decline in burn admissions following the transition to flame-resistant uniforms in theater. The Army published it. The Army's own data confirmed the uniform change reduced the severity of injuries soldiers sustained in IED attacks. That data confirmed something else simultaneously. The soldiers who had deployed in the ACU before the FRACU transition had been wearing a uniform that offered less burn protection than was medically achievable, and the Army had understood the material problem for decades. The Army would later frame flame-resistant uniforms as an essential protection against modern burn threats. That framing came after the casualties. It was not the framing used in 2005 when the ACU was fielded. The ACU had been in service for 2 years before the fix arrived. Whether those 2 years directly caused specific deaths, the Army will not say. The nylon adhesion wound pattern is documented in surgery reports. The decision to field nylon into an IED war is documented. What is not uncertain is the institutional choice that produced both. And throughout those 2 years, the operators deployed alongside conventional infantry were not wearing ACUs. Open-source photography of SOCOM elements operating in Iraq and Afghanistan throughout the mid-2000s shows a consistent pattern. Crye precision combat pants, commercial trail running footwear, non-issued gear across the board. The product names were different from the Mekong Delta. The institutional reflex was identical. Levi's in Vietnam, Crye Precision in Fallujah. 60 years apart, the gap had not moved. The fix was real. The culture that required 2 years of combat documentation and congressional pressure before applying a material science fact the Air Force had acted on 30 years earlier, that was intact. 2007, Crye Precision Multicam. Crye Precision was founded around 2000 by Caleb Crye and Greg Thompson, 2 industrial designers. No military background, no prior experience in defense procurement. They had received a research contract to explore advanced soldier systems concepts, and they approached it the way industrial designers approach any brief, by going to the people actually using the product and asking what it needed to do. Their first major product was not a weapon, it was a pair of pants. The Crye combat trouser addressed every functional failure of the ACU trouser in a single design. The ACU trouser had pocket placement optimized for inspection, positioned to look correct on parade, not to be accessible under load. No integrated knee protection. A cut designed around a standing posture that did not translate to the kneeling, squatting, and explosive lateral movement of close quarters combat. Crye resolved all 3 simultaneously. The design integrated removable foam knee pads directly into the trouser. The pocket placement came from observation of where operators' hands actually went during operations. The cut used a range of motion study of actual combat movement patterns. It came in multicam, Crye's proprietary camouflage pattern, which performed measurably better than the universal camouflage pattern in the mixed terrain of Afghanistan. The Army had spent approximately $5 billion developing and fielding the universal camouflage pattern across uniforms and gear. Multicam had been available since 2002. Think about what that means. 2 designers with no military background, working from first principles, produced a combat trouser that the Army's own operators immediately preferred over the institutional product. They did not have decades of procurement history. They did not have access to Natick's research archive. They had a contract, a brief, and the willingness to ask the people wearing the pants what the pants needed to do. SOCOM elements were purchasing Crye G3 combat pants commercially before the product had been officially issued to any U.S. military unit. Rangers, SEALs, Delta Force, Special Forces groups, all operating with gear bought out of pocket at prices ranging from $200 to over $300 per pair. Their own money, not reimbursed. Somewhere between $80 and $100 for the issued ACU set. Over $300 per pair of Crye combat pants purchased from personal funds because the $300 civilian option did the job the issued institutional product could not. 60 years earlier, operators in Vietnam were ordering $5 Levi's through the Army mail system for the same reason. The price had increased by a factor of 60. The gap had not decreased by $1. The SEAL in the Rung Sat in 1971 was answering the same question the Ranger in Kandahar was answering in 2009. The question had not changed. The catalog had. The Army adopted multicam as the operational camouflage pattern for Afghanistan in 2010. It issued the operational camouflage pattern, a multicam derivative, Army-wide beginning in 2015. The trouser design incorporated functional features that Crye and other commercial manufacturers had been producing for a decade while the Army's procurement system watched. The same sequence, completed again. $90, $300, $5. Same gap, Same operator, same catalog. Go back to the beginning. Jeans. A Levi's 501. The same model those operators wore in the Rung Sat Special Zone retails today for approximately $100. The Army combat uniform trouser costs approximately $90. A civilian pant that any American can buy at a department store costs more than the combat trousers of the United States Army. That is the gap. Measured in dollars, 60 years after the SEALs first reached for a Sears catalog. The M1941 retired. The M1943 retired. The Tropical Combat Uniform replaced. The M81 BDU replaced. The ACU still in service, still supplemented by commercial alternatives that operators buy with their own money. The Levi's 501 is still in production, 1873 design, still in the catalog. The system that equips hundreds of thousands of soldiers is not designed to optimize for what works at the worst moment of the worst war. It is designed to standardize at scale, reduce unit cost, and meet specifications written before the conflict begins. Each of those goals has institutional logic. Each of them, applied at procurement scale, produces an output that the person actually wearing it keeps having to fix. Natick Laboratories still operates. The Army still runs uniform procurement programs. The operators deploying today are still buying Crye, still buying Arc'teryx Leaf, still buying beyond clothing. The catalogs are current. The reflex has not changed. And the reflex is not confined to trousers. Delta Force went into Mogadishu in plastic skateboard helmets for the same reason SEALs went into the Rung Sat in Levi's. Navy SEALs wore $60 canvas sneakers into maritime operations for the same reason too. Different gear, different wars, the same institutional gap. The full collection of those stories is in the playlist currently on your screen. The Army fixed the uniform. It never fixed the distance between the person writing the specification and the person wearing the result. If this made you want to go deeper, the 2 books that shaped this video are linked in the description, and so is the vault, where I keep the full script, research, and everything that didn't make the final cut. Subscribe for more.